All right. So, as long as we're on the topic of an efficient pitching motion, let's move into our next segment, into the teaching moment. And I know that sometimes we see people driving cars really fast. Those cars have to stop. And I imagine it's the same way with a baseball pitching motion. If you're throwing the ball really fast, your motion is going through this thing, and I guess the body has to stop. So you're going to explain the three different ways that the body hits the brakes.
Yes, and actually, this topic is really not how the body hits the brakes correctly. It's about hitting the brakes in the middle of the motion when you don't want to be putting the brakes on.
Aha.
So, yeah, so I'm so glad I fooled you.
As usual.
That's great. Yes. So, but just to answer, but to address something you said, because you wouldn't have been the only person thinking it, is that the deceleration phase of the pitching motion is the most active phase of the motion in the sense that the muscles are working really hard. They've just done a big thing. Yes, they have to put on the brakes, and the more efficient your motion is, the more efficiently you're going to be able to put on the brakes. So, yes, it's a very important part. And what we want a body to do is we want it to get downhill. We want it to start to do all the things it does to accumulate the acceleration energy. Then we want it to accelerate, and then we want to stop the body. But, last week, the last podcast, we talked about the photo, and I got a lot of inquiry about different things, and it made me realize that everyone wants to be able to look at a picture and figure out why is he not throwing harder, especially when you have a good pitcher who's losing velocity. If he's lost velocity or he's losing it and you can't figure it out, and it may be the case where he's still hitting his spots, but he's just losing velocity. It is so important to see, is this guy in some way stepping on his own foot, shooting himself in the foot in his motion for some reason? So there's a lot of places you have to look, but whenever you're doing any kind of work with a motion issue, you always have to start at the bottom. You start at the way the bottom relates to the ground. So while there are many troubleshooting techniques for loss of velocity or why a pitcher isn't able to increase his velocity, place that we always start, and the topic for today is how the pitcher can actually be putting on the brake sooner in the motion. That would then, of course, cause the rest of the motion to slow down and not be able to take on the energy that hopefully the body was producing. So just to remind everybody, the pitcher starts his stride, and when the front foot hits the ground, that energy is supposed to be transferred up into the hips, where the hips start their rotation through three segments of rotation. The energy goes into the shoulder, and then it goes from the shoulder into the elbow and the wrist. That's how it's transferred. So when we look at the first level, the stride level, we want that foot to land, and we want to make sure that the energy is transferred upward. At that energy transfer moment, you don't want to be making certain mistakes. And the most common things that I see when I troubleshoot this issue has to do with the lower body and the stride. If you have these problems going on, you're going to have a pitcher who is not going to have a transfer of the possible energy that he has. So what we want to look at is we want to make sure that the pitcher's getting everything out of his body that he can get out of it. And for each pitcher, it's a different amount. It's relative to that pitcher. So if a pitcher is striding, for example, and we see as he strides out, you see his back knee start to drop to the ground before he is actually even rotating. So he's in his stride. His back knee is dropping down. The back knee, the back leg, by losing its length, is going to change not only where the front foot lands, but how far or how long the stride is. And whenever you have something in the back pulling you down to the mound, you are not going to have energy that's going to transfer smoothly from the foot upward, because you have something in the back pulling you down. It would be like if you are, going to start a run and you picture yourself in a 3-point start and you're getting ready and you want to make that first step out. And let's say somebody's yanking on your back leg, you're not going to be able to get out of the gate. That's what happens when the back knee drops. And the back knee drops a lot because everybody thinks you rotate the back leg. When you rotate the back knee, you want to do that to create your stride. And the knee has nothing to do with creating the stride. Everything about the stride is about the back hip. And so if the leg itself, the knee itself becomes too active, you're taking a part of your body and you're lowering it to the ground. You're losing length to the front of the body, in which case you're probably going to land low, too low to the ground. You could not have time to put the foot in the right place, but the back knee dropping to the ground is a controlling factor to the pitcher's stride. And if the stride in the base isn't correct, you're going to have problems. So one place that the pitcher loses velocity because he's actually, in a sense, controlling in a negative way his base is when you see the back knee dropping to the ground. And for people out there that do the work I do, the knee would be in excessive flexion. So, and that holds the center of mass backward. In other words, you're moving sideways, and instead of being able to continue going forward and down the hill, something is pulling the back leg downward, so it interrupts the forward motion. It may not look like it to your eyes, but it does interrupt the direction of the motion of the pitcher. So that's one of the first things you want to look for. The next thing you want to look for is the guy in his head, he's thinking the back knee is really active, and he manages not to sink down, but he pulls the foot off the ground by bringing the knee forward. He's actually pulling the knee towards the front of his body. So now he's on one leg, which is his front leg. He's also, because the back leg has shortened itself and it didn't stay on the ground to help him create length, he's also using the weight of that leg to stay back. So now this is a pitcher who can't get over his front leg because he's on only one leg. And the way he got onto just one leg is by pulling the back knee forward, which again weighs down the back of the body. So the two things I've just mentioned, whether the knee drops down and the foot stays or the knee pulls in, you're weighing down the back section of your body. So it is like the example I gave. You're trying to go forward and someone's yanking on your leg, trying to keep you backward. Everything about pitching is going down the hill, positioning the front leg, reaching out over the front leg in a stable manner, and then delivering the ball. All of this while you're accumulating energy. If you don't have those smooth transitions because you're doing something strange with your back leg, you are going to interrupt the transfer of energy. So you might have a pitcher who you're thinking of, and you go, well, he does that and he's great. Fine. But if he stops being great or he needs to be greater, you need to address that issue. So there are people that still do well with having these errors. But for those that aren't doing well and they have these errors, you have to fix that before you try to have him have a better arm or try to have him throw further over his leg. Both of these errors keep the pitcher from getting over his front leg, because you can't get over your front leg if the back leg is pulling you backward. Your center of mass has to be positioned enough to where you can get over your front leg. And the other common error that I want to mention is the pitcher who lands on his heel. This is a very common issue, and you don't always have to change it. But for you youth coaches, if you can work on this, because it's not something we recommend, it jars the pitching motion. And when you are putting your heel down first, meaning the toe is up, that is a way that we put the brakes on. In other words, if you're walking downhill, you would find yourself reaching with your leg and you would find yourself putting the heel down first because it's counterintuitive to stay on the ball of the foot because it's sort of like you would fall forward. But the pitcher's ankle should be relaxed during his stride. And the ideal way to land is the foot comes down in one piece. The second ideal way is on the ball of the foot. The least ideal way is with the heel strike. Now, when you have a heel striker, and especially as with youth pitchers, the reason why this is something just to be aware of, like I said, you don't have to always change this. But what you will also see with the pitcher who's leading with his heel is that he's reaching out with his front leg without coming off the back leg. So then he's got to put the heel down because he didn't go anywhere with his back hip. And so now he's kind of decelerating his body because now he's got to jolt himself forward. So it usually is accompanied with a lack of an ability to weight shift. But always notice the way a pitcher lands because regardless of whether he's effective or not, the heel landing does jar the motion. And the only way a pitcher can land on his heel is if there's something a little bit wrong with the weight shift in his stride. So it's another place to look. And if when you look at it, you go, wow, you know what? That's right. He's not even over his front leg. And now when he goes to rotate, he's nowhere near his front leg. And then you get the problems with not being over the front leg, which causes velocity problems. So these are just 3 ways that a pitcher puts on the brake in the middle of his motion where we don't want him putting on the brakes. We want him transferring energy, and then he stops at the end of the motion.
Right.
How's that?
That's really good. What you were talking about with the back leg dropping down to the ground. I know that I've mentioned this before in previous episodes. So listener, please be patient with me if I'm repeating myself, but there's at least one famous pitcher who is a Hall of Famer who used to do that on purpose. And for years and years, his style had been taught to actually drop the back leg, the back knee down into the ground. And it was said that if there wasn't dirt on his pant leg, then he knew he wasn't pitching well. And I remember as a high school kid trying to emulate this pitching motion because that was the way you did it, the drop and drive. And I was like, how the heck do you do this? It doesn't even make sense to my body. It just didn't feel right. And I just quit trying to do it. And it wasn't until, starting to talk to you 6 years ago that I started to understand he was kind of an anomaly that he was able to pitch as well as he did in spite of that pitching style.
Well, just to add something. So, we talked about last week, I talked about how I hate when, there's all this emphasis on the stride being too fast down the hill. The reason why all these little errors come up in the stride is because it is counterintuitive to not think that you race down the hill, but you really don't. It's a controlled motion so that you can transfer energy during rotation once the front foot lands. And when you see someone putting on the brakes on their back leg, in fact, I'm glad you mentioned this, Joe, because this is an important point. When you see with the first 2 things, with the back leg dropping down or pulling off, you want to see, especially with the dropping down, is that because the pitcher is moving so fast off his back leg that he's actually trying to slow himself down? And see, the heel landers, a lot of times you see that. You see this leg go out so fast, and they haven't even shifted off their back leg yet. Because the deal is, the part of the motion you want to understand is you want to have a weight transfer from the back leg onto the front leg. And there is a moment there where you've got 2 legs on the ground. You're not hopping from one leg to the other. So the deal is when you see this, and I think this great pitcher you're talking about had a very powerful stride, and this was his way of not overstriding, of being able to finally stabilize himself. So when you're a kid and you're thinking you've got to have a powerful stride, you may develop certain things in your mechanics that help you sort of slow down. But it's only proof of the fact that the stride has to be a very controlled sort of thing in the pitcher's motion so that it helps him develop velocity after the foot lands, once the foot lands, not inhibits the velocity. And that's what we're talking about when we're looking at a pitcher and saying, does this guy need some help with this thing that he's doing, which usually causes a pitcher to slow down? And like I said, if he's throwing 110 and he's doing it, and I doubt you're going to see that, but let's say you do, you may not say, oh, this slowing down isn't a good idea. He's probably doing it for a reason. But when you're dealing with development of pitchers, especially youth pitchers, this is such an important thing to understand. And when you see it, you should always investigate it.
And talking about how pitchers land on their heel, what I've noticed, and again, this is another myth that has evolved over the years and is still present with a lot of pitching theory. Very often when I see a pitcher who is landing on his heel, he often also is overstriding. And I think a lot of that comes from the myth that the longer you stride, the more velocity you'll have. And I feel like this is another thing that's taught. Pitchers are often taught, even at very young ages, to stride, whether it's their height or stride, 3 inches past their height or some other crazy formulation that comes up. And when pitchers try to overstride it, I feel like a lot of times that they can't help but land on their heel, and then the brakes come on. So I just wanted to point that out as well, something that I've seen in my own experience.
Absolutely correct.